Well, folks, I'm going to get things started. I want to thank you all so much for coming here to the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. I'm Peter Loewen, and I have the great honor of being the director of the school here, and I have the honor of introducing our wonderful panelists today. Before I do that, I do want to acknowledge that the land on which the University of Toronto operates is traditionally the land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and more recently the Mississaugas of the Credit. And we're lucky and privileged, and we should feel so to live and to work and to thrive and to play in this place. What a better time than today, anytime's good though, to talk about the most recent U.S. election, and what a better panel than the one we have today. I'm going to introduce them, and then I'm going to do what moderators should do. I'm going to get out of the way. So let me introduce to you in no particular order except on my sheet who we have with us today. We have the Consul General from the U.S. Consulate General in Toronto, Susan Crystal, and it's wonderful to have Susan here and also to have her as such a great supporter and partner of the many things that we do at the Munk School. For observers of Canadian politics, we have a person who needs no introduction, Ambassador Gordon Giffin, who, of course, was our ambassador to Canada from the U.S. from 1997 to 2001, proud graduate of Richville Collegiate in Etobicoke, so you can get the story on that later maybe. But he's been one of the most important voices and actors in North American politics for many decades, and we're really privileged to have him here today. The Honourable Mark Kennedy is joining us. Former congressman from Minnesota, also of note, the president at a time of the University of North Dakota and the University of Colorado. I joked at lunch that Mark's done real politics, plus he was in Congress, but it's wonderful to have him here. But he also, importantly, worked as a lead on trade under two presidents and can really speak with authority and knowledge that's unmatched on the intricacies of trade policy in the United States. Chris Sands is joining us from the Wilson Center Canada Institute. Chris was well known, and he's a great friend of Munk and a senior fellow at Massey College as well. For those of you who don't know her, you've been living under a rock for the last 30 years. Janice Stein is with us. She's the Belzberg Professor of Conflict Management and the founding director of our school, and we're so proud that she can be here too. And I'm very proud that Amanda Coletta, who's a Canada correspondent for the Washington Post and a Munk School graduate, is joining us as our very able moderator. So with that, I'll just ask you to give a huge round of applause to our panelists, and I'll turn it over to you, Amanda.
And thank you, Professor Loewen, for that kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be back here at the Munk School. Professor Loewen and Professor Stein taught my first course at the Munk School nearly a decade ago on decision-making and strategic thinking in global affairs, and I have to say that it feels much, much, much better to be the one asking the questions this afternoon as opposed to being grilled by one or both of them after a presentation on heuristics or something. Not that this will be a grilling, and if my moderating doesn't live up to expectations, that's a reflection on me and not on them. And it's an honor to be here with this terrific panel. We are going to leave some time for questions from the audience. Please write them on cue cards provided or leave them in the chat, and I'll try to get to as many as possible. And if there are specific panelists to whom you wish to direct your questions, please indicate that in your question. Each of the panelists is going to kick this off by offering a brief opening statement on some aspect of the U.S. midterm elections, keeping in mind that some of the outcomes remain uncertain. And if I may, I'd like to ask each of you to conclude your statements with one word that you would use to sum up the current state of U.S.-Canada relations. And Ambassador Giffin will get us started.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. I have a historic connection to the University of Toronto. I took my SAT test here when I was in high school in order to go to the United States to university, and I went after 12th grade. Back in those days, you had 13, so I was escaping the Canadian winter to go to North Carolina. So fortunately, at the time, I had the highest SAT score in the history of my high school, Richview Collegiate. I was the second student that took it. And it's an honor to be here with our Consul General. She administers the building on University Avenue in which I registered for the United States draft 100 years ago 1967 in the middle of the Vietnam War, and I went into the U.S. because you were required if you were outside the country to register within 30 days of turning 18 at the closest consulate or embassy. And I went in the consulate and I said, I'm here to register for the draft. And the delightful lady at the front door said, we don't have the forms. No one comes to Canada to register for the draft. So it's fun to be here. And I can't help but remind people that I actually am connected to this region of the world. U.S. elections. I am ecstatic. I have to acknowledge I'm an active practicing Democrat, so as a partisan matter, I'm glad that Democrats survived on Tuesday. But much more importantly, I'm glad our democracy demonstrated that it's vibrant and healthy, and that the electorate is a discerning electorate and will make decisions based on candidate quality and not just on the conventional sort of political considerations. Everybody says, oh, it's about kitchen table issues, it's about pocketbook issues, it's about the cost of gasoline. On the margin, the voter in the United States worried about candidate quality, the future of our democracy, and fundamental freedoms in our society. And that made a difference. They rejected extremism. They rejected people who denied the vitality of our institutions, starting with elections. Anybody who was an election denier, not anybody, not all of them, but many of them, and the most prominent ones, were defeated. So those who bemoaned or predicted that the United States was a failed democracy were corrected on Tuesday, and even if we have divided government, which we're likely to have, meaning the Republicans will control the House, they'll control it by that much, and they were supposed to win by 50 or more votes. That's my partisan part that I'm delighted they didn't. My home state of Georgia, by the way, if you're paying attention, has a runoff in the U.S. Senate on December 6th. Raphael Warnock, the incumbent United States Senator from Georgia, will win. You can write that down. If there's legal betting on elections in Canada, you can bet on Raphael Warnock. He'll win by four points or more. Quickly, the difference in the U.S. elections, I'm overgeneralizing, but women were 54% of the electorate. 55% of women, 55% of the 54%, however that works out, voted for Democrats. There was a substantial participation by young people. Young people, in my definition, is age 30 and below. 65% of people in that category voted for Democrats. And you can subdivide the electorate in all sorts of other different ways, but young people will be around for a while, by definition, and women are the growing majority in our electorate. So unless Democrats somehow disillusion them going forward, those two groups, it's a good comment from my perspective about the opportunity for Democrats to continue to govern. I think, and I'll quit here, the best thing that came out of the elections, I think, is it empowered President Biden on the international stage. It permitted him to look at our allies in Europe, in NATO, our allies in North America, Canada, and say, you can now count on us. I'm not undermined as president. I'm reinvigorated as president. Our democracy is strong. Our commitment to international alliances is strong. And you can believe me because, my side did pretty well in the election. And importantly today, when he met with President Xi of China, I don't know if you saw it on TV. I saw it this morning on CNN. When he walked across the stage to shake President Xi's hand, he was a confident, happy president of the United States. And while we have our differences with Canada from time to time, it's in Canada's interest for a happy, confident, strong president of the United States to meet the president of China. So it's a good week for democracy. It's a good week for our relations with Canada. And as I said earlier, and this is total conjecture and quite partisan, it's the beginning of the end of Donald Trump.
Thank you. Ms. Crystal,
Did
you're
I
next.
have to use one word?
One word.
Oh, I can come back to you at the end if you want to
Okay.
think about it.
No, I know my one word.
Okay, go ahead.
It was, well, one word that describes
Canada-U.S.
Canada-U.S. relations right now.
vibrant.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation for today. It's wonderful to be on such an esteemed panel. So I watched the initial results of the election sitting in the Ottawa airport, traveling back to Toronto. And, I'm looking at CNN, various on my phone, because there's just a broadcast that's a looped broadcast at so our flight was 2 hours delayed, supposed to leave at 10, it left at midnight. So at that point, they don't have live TV. I don't know why. And there's TVs everywhere, and you just keep hearing this same thing, really. So what I heard that day, now it was 10 o'clock at night, but it had been broadcast earlier in the day, so before any of the results had come in, and the broadcaster had interviewed the Prime Minister. And he said, summarizing the relationship, the friendship and solidity of the relationship between Canada and the United States will continue regardless of whatever happens in the midterms. And I do believe that his remarks ring true, and it's not just because I heard them 12 times over the course, right? Anyway. So maybe I need to write to the Ottawa airport and say, you can't just have live TV until midnight? Anyway, of course, as the ambassador said, we won't know the full effects of the midterms for a couple of weeks, certainly given the Georgia Senate race runoff. But certainly from the president's perspective, his comment was that the American people have spoken and proven once again that democracy is who we are. And I think that's a very important perspective. Certainly, the relative lack of inflamed post-election rhetoric, the several, and maybe more than several, gracious concessions. It does seem a little odd sometimes when people have to write about that, and and this person conceded because isn't that what you do? But anyway, they did, and there were, and that was good. And the defeats of several prominent election deniers suggest that a degree of civility has returned to U.S. politics, and we're hopeful that that will continue. So I guess I could leave it there because I've talked about the Prime Minister, I've talked about the President, but I'll talk just a little bit and fill in a few blanks. I think as everybody knows, last year the President virtually traveled to Canada on his first visit with a foreign leader and when he met with Prime Minister Trudeau. And during that time, the two leaders worked on the roadmap for a renewed U.S.-Canada partnership and the 6 pillars. And this comprehensive whole-of-government approach really is working to take the relationship that we have, which, yes, needed some, remedies over the past couple of years, but take it to the next level and really pass it on to children and grandchildren. I had the opportunity to serve at our embassy in Ottawa just over 10 years ago, and even though I'm from Pennsylvania, a border state, and the first time I ever left my country was to go to Niagara Falls in Toronto, back in the 70s, but even though we know it's an important relationship, and certainly serving here as a U.S. diplomat now 2 times, it's such an amazing relationship. I'll think of a lot of words I could give you, so we'll see. But the bottom line is the people that came before us built this relationship, and it's really our responsibility, those of us in the panel, the organizations that we represent, and all of us and all of you in the audience, to make sure that that continues. We certainly feel from the U.S. government that the election results should only strengthen our progress and our opportunities on the roadmap here in Canada, whether we're looking at bilateral investment, whether we're looking at climate, whether we're looking at security, et cetera. One of the things that I wanted to highlight, and it's certainly one of the pillars of the roadmap, but certainly something that I've always been interested in, and I see this every day in Toronto, is diversity. The American people made history truly by electing quite a diverse list of candidates across the political spectrum. There were the first female governors in Massachusetts, Arkansas, and New York. I think you'll remember that the woman that won in New York had fulfilled Cuomo's, so this is her first election, right? Maryland has its first black governor. Alabama elected its first female senator. In New Hampshire, voters elected the first trans man to serve in any state legislature in the country. From my home state of Pennsylvania, although I vote in Virginia because, State Department, we had the first black female who will be representing in the state, one of the representatives in the state of Pennsylvania in the House level. And Florida elected its first Generation Z, or Z, member of Congress, a 25-year-old, which is the minimum age in the House. Certainly, these newly elected officials, as well as the many incumbents who were reelected, provide new opportunities for the relationship. And certainly, given the excellent work that the Canadian Embassy and its consulates do in the United States, I wouldn't be surprised if they know a lot of these people already. But again, it's our collective job to make sure that the new electees and the incumbents have plenty of opportunities to interact across the border and keep informed about the relationship and how important it is. With respect to Canada, then, our priorities will not change. Our Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, was here last month, and his own words in Montreal said, we need Canada. We need partnerships. We need to be able to coordinate on all of the issues at hand. And we will certainly continue to work together to overcome the various, and there are many, challenges that we face as we build our countries back after the pandemic and create more diverse and inclusive societies. And I would say that my word is essential.
Thank you. Mr. Kennedy, you're next.
Well, it's great to be here with this wonderful panel, and thanks for having me. We at the Wilson Center are decidedly nonpartisan, so my comments will reflect that. As part of being president of the University of North Dakota, we have won, not during my time, we only won one national championship during my time, but we've won 8 Division I NCAA college hockey championships. In great part because we not only recruit wonderful talent from North Dakota and my home state of Minnesota, but of course from Canada. So we have great players from Red Lake and Moose Jaw and closer to here at St. Catharines. So we're appreciative to be here and appreciative of the wonderful partnership we have with Canada. I would say you saw democracy self-correct in this election. And you hopefully have excised a lot of the election denial and that backward-looking focus. But a couple things I want to point out. The Senate stayed in Democrats' hand with the decision in Nevada that was less than 1 point margin race, and yet people aren't quibbling about the Nevada race and it putting the Senate back in Democrats' hand. And you saw 2 races just recently, 2 House races. One, there was a Republican pickup, one there was a Democrat pickup that were reflective of them beating the more extreme candidate on the other side. In Oregon, there was a Democrat that challenged the incumbent, clearly to the left, beat the Democratic incumbent, but then lost to the Republican. In Washington State, you had a Republican that had voted for impeaching Trump that lost to a Republican, but then lost to a Democrat. That's that self-centering nature that democracy has that I think we saw on display and should be encouraging to all of us. But to really understand this election, midterms is always a battle between the party in power trying to make it a choice between the people in power and the people out of power. The people that are out of power want to make it a referendum on the people in power. And when you make it a referendum, it's typically very successful. For example, in the 2018 midterms, as a referendum on the current person in power, the Republicans lost 41 seats. But not only did we have the Democrats working hard to insert Trump into the election to make it a choice rather than a referendum, but you had Trump trying to insert Trump into the election, contrary to the interests of his own party, going so much as within 24 hours of the election, making a big point at a rally that he was going to have a big announcement coming up with tomorrow now. So Trump and the Democrats conspiring together to make it a choice rather than a referendum is a big part of why you saw an underperformance on the side of the Republicans and a better performance on the part of Democrats. You also saw the independents. Normally, they go against the party in power. That flipped this time. Candidate quality really made a difference. You saw the difference between the Trump-supported Senate candidate vote and the more moderate Republican governors that won being up to 10, 20-point differences. So a huge difference on that. The ambassador focuses on a couple of segments. I would focus it on Hispanics, which is the biggest and fastest growing segment in the U.S. population. And unless Republicans can gain a very significant share of the Hispanic population, it's hard for them to be a governing majority. Trump won 38% in his election win in 2016, but the Republican candidates nationwide only got 33% in this election, which again contributed to their loss. But the interesting thing was you heard about DeSantis's very significant victory with a 19-point win in Florida, a state that Trump won by 3. He won Hispanics by 54%. And so I think you're going to see a lot of the battleground in the upcoming election on that. But the Republicans are going to have a very narrow margin with a divided caucus. It's going to be very hard, particularly as each of the Republican presidential candidates will be poking and prod them to act in a certain way. That'll be something to watch. But do not forget that the Trump side of the party has been relitigating the past, which is not very appealing to voters, part of what we saw. Hopefully that's put to bed. So I think you're going to see more dynamism in the Republican message moving forward as they move to a forward focus. So lots of fun ahead for political watchers in America. My word for Canada is poised. Poised to be even more important, largely in great part on a couple of issues, one of those the Arctic. The Arctic is going to become much, much more important in the years ahead. So the new front line for the young people here between NATO, with Sweden and Finland joining NATO, and Russia during your generation will be the Arctic. And we're just beginning to wake up to that. Canada has the largest share of that front line. This is a real opportunity for Canada to shine, and I think America would welcome that. I think also as we tackle the climate issues that are causing the Arctic to become more important, as countries that understand carbon, we need to understand carbon capture and how do we remit that. And I believe that Canada's got a lot of expertise in that. That would be another way that I would say it's poised to even be more important on some of the most important issues facing us. So thanks again for the opportunity to be here.
Thank you. Professor Stein, you're next.
Thank you very much, Amanda, and great to have you back.
Thank you.
This is what happens to our graduates, you see, if any of the students are in the room. Let me just echo what Ambassador Giffin said. What's the one word I felt watching those election results? Relief. And not because of the partisan outcome, but relief because the system held. Even though there were very, very close races, there has not, the people who lost by a very small margin that one might have expected to challenge did not challenge. And I think that transcends any partisan outcome in the election, because the great fear that people had building off these last 6 years was that the foundation might crack. And I think no matter what your politics, you just have to be enormously relieved and encouraged by a capacity of one of the great democracies of the world, frankly, to right itself and to recover. And that shapes everything I want to say. My question that Peter asked me to talk about was, well, what do outsiders think of this? And you know, what do Canadians think of this? A funny question, because we're not outsiders, as we were just saying. But we have a whole raft of issues with the United States, many of which grow out of the very close relationship we have with the United States. So if you ask me what the one word I would use to describe the relationship, tempestuous family is probably the best way.
Maybe 2 words.
Maybe it's
Hyphen.
two. I hyphenated them. I hyphenated them. Tempestuous hyphen family. You know, we have the kinds of quarrels going on that come in a close family. Doesn't mean they're not quarrels, though, and so there's a whole agenda coming out of this. Let me speak more broadly about the allies who are really important to the United States as it goes out into the world. And I think allies understand the United States, by which I mean they understand there's domestic politics. They don't stop the executive branch when they come to town. They understand how diverse the United States is and how politics will vary by region. So whether it's Ottawa, London, Berlin, Tokyo, there's fairly good granular understanding. And so along with the relief, they are aware of the deep divisions. I think people put it differently. They talk about Trumpism not going away, even though Trump may go away. They argue, and I think rightly, that some of the forces that have driven populism, not only in the United States, but in Europe, remain. Working class support for Democrats is, I think, as important as all the other identity categories. I think class really matters here, too. And I think the support of the working class in the United States is going to be determining over this next round. And I think they are aware of the fact that the ship is righting itself, but it's not right. Nobody's relaxed. Let me put it to you that way. Now, that's less true about governments that know the United States less well. So I think about many Asian governments, many governments in the Middle East who will look at this, probably conclude, as Gordon Giffin did, that the best days of Trump are behind him, that they will now, and they are now looking with renewed interest at President Biden, whom they see as much more entrenched, with many fewer hurdles along the way. Ambassador Giffin talked about Biden's demeanor this morning, but there's the other side of this. Xi Jinping really did come to the table. There's a noticeable change in tone from China this morning at the summit, and a willingness to put back on the table some of the processes and substance that has been off. I don't think that's a coincidence that it came after an extraordinarily successful midterm election, which matters not only for party, as I said, but for system. I read Chinese party speeches when I get bored with reality TV. And so the big theme of those speeches for the last really 6 years has been the United States and the West is in decline. And it's in decline because of its political dysfunction. It's just going to be much harder to make that argument in a convincing way in that part of the world. So I think ranging from Beijing to Riyadh, I can count the capitals. There is going to be renewed respect for Biden and renewed confidence that they will be dealing with a stable administration, at least for the next 2 years. And that's a positive for everybody. Last comment, it'd be interesting in a way to see what lessons Viktor Orban in Hungary draws from this, right? Viktor Orban, as you all know, I see the nods in the room. We have an interesting prime minister in Italy now. It'll be interesting to see what conclusions she draws from this. British politics is convulsed as a result of the lingering disease of populism that they've gone through. So I think what happened in this election where, and to shorten it really, the election deniers got it, that is a losing strategy. That's really, I think, the single sentence that we can sum up this election with, has much broader implications for populist movements in the rich democracies because that's where these movements are thriving, with the exception of Brazil. And the Bolsonaro example is an interesting example, too. He didn't concede, but he didn't deny. If there's grounds for hope, in other words, grounds for real hope, based on what we saw over the last 48 hours. So.
Thank you. And just a reminder to people who are joining online, if you have any questions, to put them in the chat. And Professor Sands will finish this off.
Thanks very much, Amanda. And I have to say, as somebody who tries to follow Canada from Washington, I rely on your report. So thank you very much for taking up the very important beat that you have. So I'll say just 4 things about the election, and then I'm going to pivot off of your word challenge to say a few things about where I think we're headed. On the election, a couple of very obvious points, but you can never go wrong with the obvious. There's no partisan difference on Canada. Both Republicans and Democrats in the United States support good Canada-U.S. relations. In general, that doesn't mean we don't compete, doesn't mean there aren't individuals who make trouble, but in general, that the midterm elections shouldn't, on a bilateral basis, have been expected to have a huge impact. Secondly, I think the impact that Canadians most need to focus on is the impact that midterm elections have on the ability of the U.S. to govern itself. There are a lot of big challenges, from dealing with inflation to dealing with climate change to trying to boost our economy and manage this phase of globalization, not to mention global challenges like the rise of great power competition, which is upending old alliances. So there's a lot of work to do. And that goes to the third point, which is that I think the elections are important now more than ever because of their impact on U.S. leadership. And while it's true that Canada doesn't need to be led around the world, when the U.S. has a clear idea of where it wants to go, its allies have an easier time plugging in, and great things can happen when we work together. So let me fill in the blanks a little bit on that. First, on the lack of a partisan basis, we not only saw some very exciting new voices come in, we also saw a lot of people get reelected. And most of the governors who were up this time got reelected. A lot of the senators and House members who were running got reelected. And that means something because Canada, particularly during the renegotiation of NAFTA, we've talked a little bit about Donald Trump today, but during the renegotiation of NAFTA that gave us the USMCA, or CUSMA as they say up here, Canada did something really remarkable, and something I think it deserves a lot of credit for, which is a campaign that transcended party lines, that included federal and provincial officials, to go to the United States and talk about data that showed that Canada was more important to the United States than many Americans realized. It's not about ignorance, it's just about not realizing that in most districts, congressional districts, in most states, Canada is a #1 investor, is a #1 export market, is a #1 source of jobs, employment, and good things. And that's a granular story. That's a data-driven story. Canada told that not because it was the Liberal government's plan or the Conservative government's plan, but because it was Canadians. And it wasn't, here's why we're important, give us something. It was, here's why we're important. And had a big impact. I talked to congressmen, I talked to senators. They still remember the positive impression that campaign made. So now, this is an annoying professorial habit, I have to give you all homework, which is you've got to keep that up. Because one of the things that did happen in the election is we brought new faces in. A lot of incumbents reelected, but there are a lot of new people. Haven't heard the message. We have to re-engage them. We have to talk to them, have to meet the new people. And the discussion of populism brings that, I think, to a particularly sharp point. Because populism by itself is not bad. I mean, if you think populism versus elitism, it's a popular reaction against the status quo because nobody's listening to people. And that's not good in any democracy. So there are populists who were quite angry that the U.S. establishment seemed to be managing globalization to their own benefit and leaving ordinary families to deal with the consequences. We talked about this a little bit earlier at lunch, but we cannot underestimate the impact that COVID and the pandemic had on all of our politics. For some people, you could work from home. For other people, you were out of luck. And you were dealing with severe costs. And don't forget that in the United States, we don't have health care, national health care. Health care is tied to your job. You lose your job, where's your health care? We had a lot of serious problems, and we shouldn't dismiss those and say that the people who were struggling, who lashed out against politicians are all bad. What we need is a populism or an engagement with the ordinary person in the United States that shows them government can work for them. And that's more important now than ever because 2024 is already casting its shadow. Will Donald Trump run again? We may find out if he's going to run tomorrow. Will Joe Biden run again? Will there be new candidates? Will we finally have, get ready for this, a campaign in which both candidates are under 70? Could be very exciting. But all of that, I think, is part of the backdrop that this plays for our going forward. Now, Amanda asked for a word. I hate picking just one word, but I'll pick one, and that is that I think the Canada-US relationship is transitional. We're in the middle of a transition, and I don't know quite where we're going to end up. But let me talk about a couple of the transitions that I think are important. The first one, which I just hinted at, is generational. We will gradually, the amortization tables tell us, gradually move towards younger leadership. They're already here. The millennial Generation Z leaders, their generation's the majority of our electorate, just like it's the majority of yours, are starting out. Maybe they're running for state representative, maybe they're running for school board or mayor, maybe they're newly elected to Congress. It's not too early to start talking to them about what Canada, how important Canada is and how important the Canada-US relationship is. This is going to have a lot of bumps along the way. We can't assume that they're going to necessarily have, as the World War II generation, the close fighting side by side in the war to kind of help give them a solid sense of Canada. And I hate to tell you, a majority of Americans don't live that close to the border. So there are a lot of people for whom Canada is a very friendly, great white blank, with the exception of Justin Bieber. And we need to kind of get past those kind of stereotypes and fill in that blank with some knowledge. Second, we're in a technological transition. I don't have to tell a younger audience this, but whether we're talking about the technology that gives us an approach to climate change, to moving from fossil fuel vehicles to electric vehicles, to even potentially moving to electric airplanes and other technology, there's a lot that's coming. It's a lot of dislocating change. It's not only going to affect how we live our life, it's going to affect how we make our living. And I think that's really important now in an era where the U.S. is trying to reshore so that our efforts in international trade and globalization bring jobs home to Americans, but potentially Canadians too. And we are competitors there, but I think there's enough of the pie growing, whether it's trying to create more electrical generation capacity or more charging stations or more electric vehicles, where we could profit together if we do it right. Next transition, disintermediation. In my lifetime, the biggest change to Canada-US relations. This is going to sound old, but when I started out, we used to like get the Globe and Mail delivered by Air Canada, and I'd get like a week at one time that would show up at Johns Hopkins Sites, and we'd go through the paper and we'd try to cut things out without the thing on the other side of the page being ruined. Now, Canadians and Americans talk all the time. Even as we speak, I guarantee you there are a lot of young Canadians, young Americans playing a video game at the same time, even when they should be in school. So we have a lot of interactions, and it used to be that the management of that could be affected by experts. We could sort of say, well, here, we'll tell you what Canadians are like. Now that constant interaction means that we all need to become smarter about each other's politics and not have a cartoon version of them, and we all have to be willing to engage in conversations about our bilateral relationship. I know that's putting more homework on you, but I think it's important. And that leads me to my last transition. I turned one word into a whole paragraph. This is great. And that is renovation. I think that we are in a love it or list it moment in the Canada-US relationship. It isn't working for us the way it did. We have a lot of good elements, but I think we need to look at our institutions. We decided with NAFTA and Canada's free trade not to create a delegation of sovereignty. We have sovereignty separately. We make our own decisions. But how do we share the data that we need to make those decisions? How can we work towards consensus? The International Joint Commission, some of you will know, is a little more than 100 years old, was set up to manage an obvious shared problem, Great Lakes water quality and the water quality of rivers. That institution could use some upgrades. Why aren't we using it, for example, Gordon will know, Ambassador Giffin, why aren't we using it to have a bigger conversation about the Enbridge Line 5 pipeline that's going right through the Great Lakes, where the contention is that it's damaging the environment? Let's ask the scientists. We have this institution. We could do that. But there are more institutions needed, more updates to our relationship needed. I have every expectation that we can do it, but I think we're going to have to make some real efforts. So Canada-US relations is poised. It is in relief. It is a good thing, but we're going to have to make it work. And I think there's a lot of work to be done. And it's tumultuous too.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Over to you.
Thank you. So for those keeping track, the 5.5 words are vibrant, essential, poised, tempestuous, family, and transitional. I want to take a step back a little bit because I've heard David Cohen, the U.S. Ambassador to Canada, speak often in interviews about how he didn't quite appreciate the sense of betrayal and mistrust that people on this side of the border, not just politicians, but business leaders, nonprofit leaders, and he mentioned he was traveling during the pandemic and he'd speak to everyday Canadians in hotel lobbies, that they felt after 4 bruising, I think it would be fair to say, Trump years. By all accounts, Prime Minister Trudeau and President Biden seemed to be chummier. During their first bilateral meeting, the virtual one that we mentioned, the Prime Minister quipped that it was nice that U.S. leaders weren't removing all references to climate change in communiques. But there are still irritants, long-standing ones like softwood lumber, newer ones like the dispute around Line 5. Governor Whitmer was reelected in Michigan. The dispute over the Nexus program, which Canada's ambassador to the United States has said is being held hostage by her U.S. counterparts. So I guess I wanted to get a sense to what extent this relationship has been repaired, and given the makeup of the new Congress, what opportunity there is for further repair or conflict. And maybe I'll start off with Ms. Crystal. You mentioned you were in Ottawa a decade ago, and you returned a couple of years ago. So did you also notice a similar sense of mistrust? Was there a change in how Canadians were thinking about the United States that you picked up on when you arrived?
Good question, thank you. I think the ambassador probably sees it a little differently than I do, and I recognize what he said, and he's, had some very interesting conversations. Maybe because I knew a little bit, and maybe because I'm always like looking at like the young level. I felt that coming back to Canada was just a great opportunity because even though it came from border state, all of that, when you come to Canada, you appreciate, and at least I found, and I don't know about my other American colleagues here, I felt I learned more about my own country in the time I spent in Canada than I ever expected because of everything that we do together. And so I think from my perspective in going from Ottawa to Toronto, of course, it was also a bit of a weird time because I arrived in the middle of COVID. So, and to your point, right, you meet a lot of people, but you're not necessarily out on the streets and seeing. By the time the ambassador got there in December, that was right before Omicron, but things were, kind of opening up. So I would say that overall, from my personal perspective and professional perspective, the relationship had definitely changed in some respects. Sometimes it was more difficult because I know definitely, and I talked to predecessors in the interim that had a much more difficult time in conversations with people than I have found that I've had, maybe because of exactly when I did come. So I would say that overall, I know what the ambassador's seen and what he's heard, and I appreciate that. But from me personally, not so much.
Ambassador Giffin, do you want to weigh in? I know you have to leave a little early.
I'm not encumbered by currently being a diplomat, so I can be flippant. Actually, I'm bitter at Canada. You sent Ted Cruz to the United States. Would you take him back? I think that was very unfair. And if you think you were brutalized by Donald Trump, you should have been in the United States. Our democracy was in peril because of the guy, so don't take it personally. Everything doesn't relate to you. He was just a bad guy. So it wasn't about Canada. And this is the sort of core point. I grew up in Canada. I lived in Canada from age 6 months until I went to university in the United States. My father was born in Pembroke, Ontario. My grandfather, for whom I'm named, was born in Brockville. I'm about as much of a Canada-phile as you can be as an American. That said, throughout my multiple decades of life, there tends to be a chronic feeling in Canada that you're being ignored by the United States. And it can fester. And it's, you people don't pay enough attention to us, and I'm mad about it. Well, there's lots of parts of the world that wish they were you. They wish we would pay less attention to them. So, don't get so upset about it. In some ways, when I was nominated and became confirmed to become ambassador in Canada, I came up here, and Jim Blanchard, who's a dear friend of mine, preceded me as ambassador to Canada. And Jim is a great guy. He was governor of Michigan, knew a lot about Canada because of proximity to Canada. But when Jim got here, he made a big deal out of taking the train across Canada so he could do a listening and learning tour about Canada. And the press came to me and said, are you going to similarly do a trip across Canada to do a learning tour of Canada? I said, no, I did that when I was 6. I don't need to do that again, which they took to be flippant and that I wasn't interested in Canada. But in Ambassador Cohen's case, he's from Pennsylvania. That's a little farther south than Michigan. So, other than following the Philadelphia hockey team and so forth, he had to experience a little bit directly, upfront, and personal as he traveled Canada. And I think there was a residual concern about the Trump years, so he had to get that firsthand. But I think if you talk to him today, he would indicate that we are on a very stable, steady course. We do have aggravations. I dealt with softwood lumber when I was here 20 years ago. It won't go away. It's Groundhog Day. It just keeps coming back. And frankly, I know this will sound provocative, but it's not all our fault. There's some culpability on the Canadian side, so everything isn't entirely our fault. So that'll be around for a while, I think. We probably won't get that one resolved, but so much works so well. And it's on the margins that it doesn't work well. And the dialogue between Canada and the United States, you get along, Ontario gets along better with the United States than you do with Alberta, so, get over it.
So, can I read you next? Is that all right on this one?
Yes.
I'm neither a current diplomat nor an ex-diplomat, so I can even be blunter than the former ambassador. Donald Trump was a monstrous shock to this country. He said, under the national security clause, you guys are a problem. Now, come on, even from your closest relative, that was traumatic. And I have lived in this country. I've never seen the level of insult and outrage that Canadians felt. They felt bruised and battered. But that left as soon as he was succeeded. So it wasn't the United States, it was Donald Trump. But there was
and
really,
he did it to everybody.
yeah,
not
but
just,
we are not everybody. We're special. You know that. We have a special relationship with you.
I forgot.
And you need to pay more attention to us because we're fragile and we'll be hurt if you don't, okay? All right, so we got all of that out of the way now. Now let's get a little granular. There's an access program in this country. It matters to, I don't know how many, close to 750,000 people across the border, Canadians and Americans, that way, and it's great. And it makes our life a lot easier. It's stalled. Tell me how this relationship is working when the people that cross the border and travel between the two countries have been stymied now about privileges for U.S. Nexus interviewers who can't find, the dispute is about where those people and what offices they can be. Can they be on government property or not? Help me out here. How is this relationship working? Gordon, what's your version of the story?
how does it get resolved?
No, well, yeah, how how do we explain to Canadians what this is about?
It's pretty simple. We had this issue. Have any of you been through pre-clearance at Pearson Airport?
Yeah.
Isn't that a pretty, I mean, I know sometimes the lines are long, but it's a pretty neat service. You know, if you're flying to Miami, you don't get behind some 747 from South America. You're in the country, okay? When we started to implement that during my time, there were protests in parts of Canada that Canada was ceding sovereignty
We got over it.
to the United States, that the government shouldn't permit American officers to have authority in Canadian airports. And it got to the point where it was quite troublesome. So finally, the government of Canada actually enacted new legislation, new law, that, and it's quite restricted, but it gives American officers a right and authority in Canadian airports to enforce American law. And as a result, we still have pre-clearance. I was going to have to close pre-clearance because people were worried about the sovereignty of the floor space in Pearson Airport. It's the same debate, in effect, about the office for Nexus, for Pete's sake. Just fix it.
So, if we use all those adjectives, I would say for me, just fix it, is when we're looking at this relationship. If we can't get this solved, then I don't know how we deal with the bigger ones, right?
And I believe Ambassador Giffin, you won an award from the State Department for your work on
yes,
pre-clearance.
For pre-clearance.
He started
So maybe we
And
need to
it
throw you
was-
back in the ring.
And today,
Gord's program.
it's actually, keep this quiet, because if the American Congress figures this out, it'll end. 70% of Nexus cardholders are Canadian,
Yeah.
okay? And the vast majority of people that use pre-clearance are, guess what? Canadian. This is a service being paid for by the United States taxpayer in Canadian airports that's substantially used by Canadians. If the American Congress ever figures this out, there's a problem. So making noise about what office the American officers get, it's just nutty.
Stay tuned, folks. This one's not resolved, and we're getting so close that I hear people talking about canceling the program.
Our Consul General is now wondering what kind of an ambassador I was.
I would say that, first of all, right now, I think the numbers are closer to 80% of Nexus cardholders are Americans, or are Canadians. And you're absolutely right, the US pays for the cards, mails the cards out. I mean, that's all our taxpayers, right? I would say that certainly there are conversations continuing. I've not heard cancellation. It's more of we are in discussion to how to figure this out. Yes, could Canada just say, okay, CBP officer walks out of pre-clearance, walks down the hall, goes to the Nexus office, and they can give them legal authority to do that? Yeah, but Canada says they can't do that, so.
I actually think they could look under the law that we passed for pre-clearance and construe it to permit that.
Yeah, they could, but I mean, that's what, Ambassador Hillman, et cetera, and that's their side. But there are conversations going on to figure out, are there other ways we could get at it? The U.S. does not interview people virtually. But, could there, there have been talks of could they, somebody, if you're crossing the land border, you have your interview on one side, your interview on the other side, while you're at, how that, is that gonna happen tomorrow? No, it's not gonna happen tomorrow.
Or Canada could say, you can do this.
Yeah.
We could turn it all upside down, or.
See, I spend my life worrying
Yes.
about maybe Putin will use nuclear weapons. Maybe there'll be some sort of unauthorized use of an unconventional weapon, and we can't solve this problem.
I'm going to let you get serious now. I apologize. I have to run.
Thank you.
That was Gord's program, actually. That's why I brought it up. And it's a measure to me, though, of how we can let granular detail with some abstract principle that makes no sense in the context of this relationship get in the way of the practical realities. And of course, they're more Canadian, Susan, because we cross into the United States much more frequently than Americans cross into Canada.
I wanted to ask about sort of the strategy that Professor Sands mentioned about how Canada has been dealing with U.S. relations, this sort of going around the White House, getting, lawmakers from all sides of the political spectrum, premiers who don't necessarily agree with the prime minister, business leaders to sort of meet with their counterparts on the opposite side of the border. When Minister Jolie went to Washington at the end of September, she didn't just meet with Secretary Blinken, she met with the top-ranking Democrat and Republican on the Senate's Foreign Relations Committee. And that was in part to ensure that there is continuity after the midterms. So I wonder if you think this continues. I mean, you said this is a good approach, but should it be enhanced in some way? And are there other sort of strategies that you would advise Canadian officials to look to as they try to navigate what could be a divided Congress?
Oh dear. I only wanted to say you should do it, not that I could explain how, but let me take it this way. And I'm going to go back to something that actually Janice and Ambassador Giffin mentioned. And that was, it was really interesting because you were talking about how Canadians feel like nobody's listening. We get very offended. And actually I think that's a commonality with some of the populism in the United States. We've created a world in which there are a lot of people who don't feel like the people in power are listening to them. And the right response to that is not, a fact sheet, but empathy and connection. And so I think, yes, the data helped, but as Canadians reached out, they also reached out face to face. They were people who could compare notes about living on farms or as Mark Kennedy talks about, having a common interest in hockey. It really is at that very basic level that we need to take the next step. We have well-informed relations because we can change the data, but we don't always have that deeper understanding of the importance this has to the other person. And I know that's going to make me sound like a 1970s New Age guru, but a little bit of empathy goes a long way. And I think sometimes the way in which we talk about Canada-U.S. relations can be a bit adversarial, can be a bit like us versus them. If the Americans get it wrong, they're mean. And I think there's more room for us to talk about these problems that we have as shared problems that we have to figure a workaround, which is very much the way Janice Stein talked about Nexus. Like, can we just figure out a way to resolve this and not elevate it to a breaking point in Canada-U.S. relations, but sort of understand that at a technical level, we're always competing, we're always having issues. We had a conversation about this a little bit earlier with regard to the Inflation Reduction Act, and score one for Canada, because Canada pointed out early on in Build Back Better that the U.S. was talking about subsidies for electric vehicles that could only be used for vehicles made in the U.S., and that was going to be a problem for Canada. Score one for Canada because someone like Joe Manchin, who actually went to Alberta and had a chance to hear from Canadians, said, okay, you know what, we're going to change that. We're going to say North America is what matters, and that's what matters for the auto industry, which is great. But of course, now there's some subsidies that will try to draw in electric battery manufacturers from South Korea, Canada, the Netherlands, other places to make sure that happens in the U.S. The answer isn't to say, oh, those stupid congressmen. The answer is instead to say, well, wait a minute. Let's talk about how we actually make cars. Let's talk about how we have so much demand for batteries that the U.S. can get jobs and so can Canada. We can grow the pie rather than making this a confrontation. And no less a person than Senator Joe Manchin showed that when Canada articulates a fair-minded response and does it in a very human way, you get results. But when we sit on our hands and complain that Donald Trump is a mean guy, there may be nothing we could do otherwise, but I think that kind of level of politics doesn't necessarily get us to solutions. I care a lot about the bilateral relationship, and I live in the weeds of it, but I know that it still comes down to a people-to-people friendship. And the job of all of us who try to work on the relationship is to be a steward of that friendship and not to make it harder and not to make it more tone deaf. And so, again, I think we do have to do a lot of outreach, but we should be paying a lot of attention to the baseline, which is that Canadians, Americans are friends and want it that way, and we just have to make that work.
Mr. Kennedy, do you have thoughts? And maybe you could talk a little bit about what Canada can expect on the trade front, given the enormity of that relationship between the two countries.
Well, I would say as a congressman from Minnesota, if you came into my office from Wisconsin, I would be nice to you, but I wouldn't pay much attention to what you really thought because you're elected by your voters from Minnesota. So as a Canada, if you want to influence American policy, Chris talked about how many investments you have down there, what kind of trade flows you have. If you have people from a Canadian-owned company in a particular district go and talk to their member, they'll pay attention to that person. If they have somebody who the trade relationship with Canada, either because they're an export market or they're a critical supplier to help them, create jobs in their district, they'll care about it. So I think you need to be more granular and bring it down to who is a friend of Canada in various districts, various states, and have them talk to the electorates on behalf of it. On the trade policy, let's not forget that trade has historically been driven by the Republican Party. Donald Trump did a lot of things that people don't like. I protested President Bush when he put tariffs on steel. There's 10 times as many metal bending jobs in America as there are metal producing. So the insanity of having any kind of tariffs from a security perspective with anybody, especially friends like Canada, was a bit silly. And the security anyway, and the next conflict, which we're going to do everything we can to avoid, is going to be more cyber and space than it is going to be steel and aluminum. But I think we need to be aware that the Republicans have driven the trade agenda in the past. So be careful if you're, on one hand, criticizing Trump, that many Republicans like, and then saying we want to do more in trade. The Democrat Party, by the nature of the unions having such a significant voice in primaries, are allergic to trade. Most of the Democrat members in Congress I knew were personally pro-traders, but could not afford to vote pro-trade, or they would face a primary challenge from the unions. So I think there is still hope for trade, because the voting electorate, if you look at the Democrat voters, they're more pro-trade than Republican electors. So it's a complicated weave that we have to weave to get back to a pro-trade agenda. And I think it all comes into the great power competition we have with China. The defining issue of our day is that the two largest economies with the two largest militaries are now in very vital competition. We need to be cooperating on things like climate, but in everything else we're in competition, and that will shape every individual, every organization, every nation. And in that competition, the United States is stronger as North America than as the United States. And so I think Canada's path towards a tighter relationship from a trade perspective is as an ally that, China can't reach up to its northern or southern neighbors and embrace them in the trade in the same that we can. And we need to capture that opportunity in the focus of making sure that the global order that's focused on democracy as opposed to coercion and deterring aggression succeeds.
So there's been no shortage on this side, no shortage of concern, I should say, on this side of the border about the health of U.S. democracy and institutions in recent years. Many of you said that you were pleased with the outcome of the election because it seemed to suggest that there was some sort of correction going on. The Washington Post has been tracking how election deniers have been faring, and you mentioned some of the high-profile election deniers who lost their races. But I looked at the tracker last night, and there are still, I think, more than 170 election deniers in U.S. House, Senate, and key statewide offices who are projected to win their elections. So we've gotten a couple of versions of this question. Is there anything about the state of U.S. democracy that concerns you in the short or long term? And how should Canada be looking at that and responding?
Can I make this a binational concern? I want to draw back our attention to the way we closed the border for COVID. At Wilson, we put together a Wilson Center task force to look at public health in the U.S.-Canadian border, and we found what you were reporting on in the Washington Post. There were a lot of people who lived near the border who were really hurt by that. And what was striking was, where were the congressional hearings? Where were the parliamentary hearings? Who was talking about people in Point Roberts or International Falls who were used to going back and forth just for their daily lives? And we said, well, public health is important. Now, We came after 9/11, our border security people realized they had to do risk management. You can't have 100% border security. You have to look at where the threats are. Did we listen to the border security community? No, we listened to the public health community. All very nice people. But when I think about the weakness of our democracies, I look at a period of time where politicians of both parties, all parties in Canada, really said, no, just shut up and wait. And we knew they had consequences. We knew they had legitimate grievances, but we didn't listen. That's why I say empathy matters. I'm back to being a 1970s health guru here, but I think that we need to learn to listen to legitimate public complaints. And this is where I'm a little uncomfortable with sometimes the way in which we try to foreclose conversation. And I'm going to say this gently, but you're talking about election deniers. And there are definitely people who believe elections have been stolen, but there are also people who raise legitimate criticisms about things. And we have to make a distinction because sometimes it's okay to be critical. And something we talked about earlier that I want to bring back is Ukraine. There are some Republicans and Democrats who are running this time we're talking about, are we spending too much in Ukraine? And they came from different points of view. Some Democrats felt that our focus on trying to help the Ukrainians was costing us money that we should be spending to make things better here at home. The old, let's build at home, not build abroad. Some Republicans were saying, well, the rate we're sending our weapons away, we've got to be building a lot more because we're looking at a serious conflict potentially with Russia and China. We can't afford to empty out the armory and then hope for the best. We have to be careful. Now, that's not Ukraine denying, that's not having a discussion about being pro-Putin, but I think we've gotten better at excluding people from a conversation and ruling them out, and to use the phrase, canceling them, than we have about listening to them. And I don't think a lot of politicians necessarily don't listen to other people. I think a lot of us have stopped listening to them. And because we don't think people are listening to us, we become quite frustrated with the system. So for me, that's where I think our democracy needs help. We need to listen more.
We have Peter in the room here, so Peter, there's a chair if you're not exhausted, come in, because this is right in Peter's wheelhouse. But let me say, that question, what's wrong with democracies, is huge. Because there is no perfect democracy. There never has been in the history of democracy. There's no form of representation that is perfect. And so it's always a work in progress, frankly. And democracies are more fragile than we thought, and they need more work than we thought. But I think Chris is making a really important point, that there are divides. If you look at those races, I was struck watching that election, right? Over and over again, 49.3, 50.7. These are really hard-fought, divided constituencies. And we have them in Canada, too. It's simply not true to say that we don't have them. And we have the ideological divides. And so the really hard work of democracy, I believe, is not asking, where do I disagree with you, but where do I agree with you? What do I agree on, despite what we disagree on? And I think the real challenge, and by the way, that is a harder conversation to me to have with my liberal friends, who tell me they won't talk to those kind of people, than it is to have with some of my more conservative friends, to be blunt here. And if we cannot refrain from the labeling and try to find, what do we agree on? We will have a real hill to climb. That's probably, to me, institutions really matter. Democratic institutions. I'd be the last person to say that institutional design is not important. It's hugely important. But underlying any institutional design is a willingness of people who differ deeply about things to come together and say, okay, we can work on this problem together. We can fix this. We can solve this. And that muscle to do that is weakened in both the United States and in Canada. And it's a really important thing for all of us to do.
Go ahead.
I would just build on that and agree that the only thing written on the U.S. seal is e pluribus unum out of many one, and we only function if we get the factions to come together. But let me just give you one lens that you may not have thought about when you address people that are skeptical about the election results, is that America is increasingly self-sorting. Not just the 2 out of 3 people that are voting Democrat live in an urban area, and 2 out of 3 people that consistently vote Republican live where there's more space, but it's creating by states And so you saw a lot of migration happen during COVID from the Northeast down into Florida. Part of why you saw Florida turn more red is the red voters coming in. Part of the reason why the Democratic voters in the Northeast maybe had a little bit easier time, because some of the Republican voters left. 2/3 of our states are one party controlling everything consistently, which is why one of the odd things was, from that perspective, and should be noted, a Democratic governor in Kansas won re-election. And that was sort of out of step with states just moving into one party controlling them. So most people live in an area where they don't know somebody from the other party. Frankly, if you live in Castroville, Texas, you couldn't name a Democrat that you knew. If you live in Boston, you'd have a hard time. If there are Republicans in Boston, they keep it to themselves. And so they just can't imagine that how did this not go this way? I don't know anybody that voted that way. And that's part of the innate skepticism. You're also having the reduced trust in institutions. We talked about the importance of institutions, and people don't trust the institutions. They're skeptical. They think they have a devious means. But the one positive thing besides the vote was that we did a better job of not making election night seem like it's Super Bowl, like it's all going to be decided tonight. We did a better job, the press did, of talking about the process. They had that little panel that went over and they said, this is how many mail ballots are left. And if you're not going to count between 1 and 4, tell people ahead of time you're not going to count between 1 and 4 a.m. And I think the fact that we don't have a lot of angst going on in America, even though the House is not decided, is a maturity and an evolution of an understanding of elections that I think will be helpful in elections to come.
It's so interesting, if you look at the election in Brazil, in which there was a comparable divide, right? One of the process innovations there was to count all the mail ballots before the polls closed. So as soon as the polls closed, they could announce the results of the mail-in ballots. They had a result by 11 o'clock at night, which I think, when you're very divided, is helpful, that you don't prolong a process over days and days to count mailed-in ballots, because then all these allegations of interference and fraud just diminish, frankly. I think we could learn from the Brazilians here.
And part of the skepticism came from the fact that because of COVID, we had to make significant changes in the voting process and make it more digital, and we had less time to plan because people got together. So, I mean, you threw them with a whole bunch of new stuff, and I think that also contributed to the angst that we've suffered through the last couple of years.
Before we finish this part of it, it's really interesting because there's polling data on sorting, right? That we're seeing something we have not seen before in the United States, which is sorting by neighborhoods. But the really telling question to me was, and it was over time, it was data over 100 years, Peter, on this question, I think you know this data very, very well, in which they asked parents, whom would you most hate for your child to marry? Now, it used to be, oh my God, a Catholic, a Jew, that was the worst thing that could happen to you. Today, if you're a Democrat, a Republican, if my child married a Republican, I'd disown her. And a Republican, it's so revealing when you think about it. A Republican, he was a Democrat. So right now, think about how deep that polarization is, that the most intolerable thing is to have a son-in-law from the opposing political party. And the numbers were not just 50%. I mean, it's one of the worst measures of sorting that I've ever seen. It's so personal.
Just one thing to add.
Yes, and I had
any
a
of the
quick question
people-
for you, too.
Oh, okay.
It hasn't gone unnoticed here that President Biden hasn't visited in person, so if you have any insight into
insights?
whether that might happen.
I would just say just to close on the other, and I'll answer that, or I'll try to anyway. Don't forget that, all these people, whether they were an election denier or not, or they still have to govern. So they have to, and they want to get reelected. I mean, everyone wants to, right? If you like to be in government, you right to get reelected. So how do they do that? They have to work for their constituents. And to work for their constituents, they have to work within the system. and, work with the Social Security Administration to get someone help for Social Security benefits or veterans or whatever it might be. So it's a learning process as well. And so I think it can be a very interesting process in democracy. I mean, after all, we say in the United States, we work to form a more perfect union. Not perfect, just more perfect. Right, so there you go. Yes, we know that the president has not yet come to Canada, besides virtually. Our understanding is that, yes, he is planning to come, but when, I can say, you heard it here first, he's coming to Canada, but when, I don't know.
Susan, it's okay, we're not hurt, okay?
I know he wants to come. I think there was a lot of thought that he would come in the fall, and then he got COVID, and then got it again, and then the election, so I'm hoping 2023, but we'll
But
see.
for what it's worth, Canada should host the North American Leaders Summit in 2023, and that
Oh,
would be
and
a
then
fine
you
time
get
to
him.
come. Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
Okay, let's sum up what we've learned. President Biden's coming to Canada and to the Munk School. I heard that.
Heard it first here.
100% of Nexus holders are North Americans. Keep that in mind, if you don't mind. We don't have to get into who's got more, all right? I think the third thing is that, for those who are close American watchers, maybe the world looks a little bit better, but it's still the case that as much as that pressure relief valve has been opened, it's really a sensitive time for the United States. There's a lot of uncertainty in both parties, I think in the near term and in the medium term. And for Canadian watchers and for us at the school who are really interested in trying to figure out what the possible futures are of the United States, it's really helpful for us to have the kind of expertise that we've been able to welcome here to the school today. So I'm just going to ask you to join me first and just give me a quick appreciative round of thanks to Chris and to Susan and to Mark and to Amanda and Janice. There are two more just sets of thank yous I want to give. I do want to thank the Wilson Center and the Canada Institute, for which Chris is a very able head of that, but they've been a wonderful partner of U of T and of Canada actually for a long, long time. And then the second last thanks I want to give is to Amanda. Thank you very, very much for leading this conversation. I wouldn't want to be penned in by you as a journalist, but it's wonderful to watch you ask other people tough questions. Thank you very much. And the third group to thank is all of you for coming. So those of you who are online and are here in person, we really appreciate your coming. It's something to start coming out to events in person, and we're really thankful that all of you are here at the Munk School. So thanks very, very much to everyone here and there. Cheers.